On the charge of involuntary manslaughter, I find you, Asher Crawford, guilty. You will be remanded to a juvenile facility.
The first sound anyone heard that morning was the sharp, final crack of wood on wood. The gavel. It wasn't just a sound. It was a period at the end of a sentence everyone in that room had been holding their breath for. The trial of Asher Crawford was now, officially, in session. And let me tell you, the air in that Cedar Falls courtroom was so thick with tension you could practically chew it. On one side of the aisle sat the Jensen family. Helen and David Jensen, looking like they'd aged 20 years in the months since their son Noah died. They weren't just grieving, they were hollowed out. Empty shells clinging to the hope of some kind of justice. And right behind them, the entire town seemed to be packed in, a sea of supportive, somber faces. On the other side were the Crawfords. Now, if you didn't know any better, you might think they were at a business merger. Impeccably dressed, backs straight, faces carved from stone. They had money, they had influence, and they had brought both with them in spades, represented by a lawyer in a suit that probably cost more than my car. And then there was the boy himself. Asher Crawford. 15 years old. He was small for his age, swimming in a suit that seemed a size too big. He was led to the defense table by a bailiff, and he moved like he was in a dream. No, not a dream, a trance. His eyes were downcast, his expression completely, utterly blank. He slid into his chair and didn't move a muscle. He was a ghost in his own trial. Up on the bench, presiding over this entire circus of pain, was Judge Harold Henderson. He was a man who'd seen it all, and it showed in the weary lines on his face and the slow, deliberate way he moved. He didn't seem angry or sympathetic. He just looked heavy, like the weight of every terrible story he'd ever heard was resting on his shoulders. The prosecutor stood up, a tall woman with a voice that was calm but carried immense gravity. "Your Honor," she began, "this is the story of a vibrant life, brutally cut short. This is about a boy named Noah Jensen, who had his future stolen from him on a cold, rainy night at Ravens Point." And as she spoke those words, I need you to picture this. Asher Crawford, the boy accused of taking that life, didn't flinch. He didn't look at Noah's weeping parents. He just stared at the grain of the wooden table in front of him, completely detached. It was the strangest, most unsettling thing. It was the quiet before the storm. And let me tell you, the storm that was coming, nobody in that room could have possibly seen it coming. Now, if the first day was about procedure and posturing, the second day was when the heart of this tragedy was laid bare for everyone to see. This was the day the Jensen family had to stand up and, in front of God and everyone, describe the hole that had been torn in their universe. The first person the prosecutor called to the stand was Helen Jensen, Noah's mother. She walked up there looking fragile, like a strong gust of wind might break her in two. She clutched a single folded piece of paper in her hand like it was a lifeline. And when she started to speak, her voice was so quiet the judge had to ask her to speak up, but it was the kind of quiet that commands a room. You could have heard a pin drop. She didn't start with the crash. She started with his life. She talked about Noah's laugh, a loud, goofy, uninhibited sound that could fill up a whole house. She described his room, a mess of dirty clothes and textbooks, with blueprints for a treehouse he wanted to build taped to the wall. He was going to be an architect, she said. He didn't just see buildings. He saw spaces where people would live and love and make memories. And then, she did something that shattered everyone in that courtroom. She described the silence. She talked about the first morning after he was gone, walking past his bedroom door and not hearing the shower running. She described setting the table for dinner and, out of pure habit, putting out 4 plates instead of 3. The sound of that extra plate clattering on the table when she realized her mistake was, she said, the loudest sound she'd ever heard. She looked directly at Asher Crawford then. Not with anger, but with a profound, gut-wrenching confusion. "I just want to know why," she whispered. "I just need to know what could have been so terrible that my son never came home." Asher didn't look up. He kept his eyes fixed on that same spot on the table, his jaw tight. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, a silent command to stay still, to show nothing. Next was David Jensen, Noah's father. His grief was different. It was a quiet, raging storm held back by sheer force of will. His voice was rough gravel as he described being called to the morgue. He didn't go into detail, thank God. He just said, "The boy on that table was my son, but the light was gone. The light was just gone." With every word, the weight in the room grew heavier. This wasn't about legal theories anymore. It was about a stolen future. It was about a family broken in half. And sitting in the center of it all was a 15-year-old boy who showed absolutely nothing. No flicker of remorse. No shadow of sadness. It was like he was listening to the weather report for a country he'd never visit. And that silence, his silence, was starting to speak volumes. After the raw, bleeding emotion from the Jensen family, the atmosphere in the courtroom was bound to shift. And shift it did. The next phase of the trial felt like someone had thrown a switch, turning the entire proceeding from a heart-wrenching drama into a cold, clinical chess match. This was the defense's turn to play, and their strategy became clear almost immediately. They weren't going to fight the facts head-on. They were going to build a fortress of silence and doubt around Asher Crawford. First through the gate were Asher's own parents, Richard and Victoria Crawford. They sat up there on the witness stand like a royal couple giving a press conference. Their words were perfect, rehearsed. They talked about Asher being a sensitive soul, a boy who preferred the logical world of computers and chess to the messy world of people. They described him as quiet, introverted, deeply affected by the cruelty of other teenagers. They painted a picture of a boy who was practically a ghost in his own school, incapable of the violent rage the prosecution was describing. It was a masterclass in reframing. They weren't talking about the boy who might have run Noah off the road. They were talking about a misunderstood genius, a scapegoat. And you could feel a tiny, uncertain fissure crack open in the room. Could they be right? Was this all a terrible misunderstanding? Then, the defense brought out their big gun, a psychologist named Dr. Evans. He was a calm, soothing man with glasses and a gentle voice, and he started talking about something called autism spectrum disorder, specifically a form that used to be called Asperger's. He used words like flat effect and social pragmatism deficits. In simple terms, he explained that Asher's brain might be wired differently, that his lack of eye contact, his stone-faced expression in court, his inability to show what he was feeling, it wasn't a sign of a cold-hearted killer. It was a symptom, a medical condition. He made it sound so reasonable, so scientific. He was subtly telling everyone in that room, "You're reading him all wrong. Your expectation of tears and remorse is a language he doesn't speak." And through it all, Asher just sat there. He was the living, breathing embodiment of everything the doctor was saying. A blank slate. He didn't react to his parents' praise. He didn't flinch at the clinical diagnosis. He was a puzzle no one could solve. The defense attorney drove the point home during his cross-examinations. He stood before the jury, his voice dripping with reason. "Where is the physical evidence?" he asked. "No witnesses saw my client's car touch Noah Jensen's car. There are no skid marks from a chase. No DNA. No confession. All you have is a tragic accident and a lonely, awkward boy who was in the vicinity. That's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a tragedy compounded by a witch hunt." And you know what? It was working. The certainty that had filled the room after Helen Jensen's testimony was starting to evaporate, replaced by a low, buzzing hum of doubt. The prosecution had a mountain of emotion, but the defense was building a wall of cold, hard logic. And sitting silently in the middle of it all was Asher, a boy who was either a profoundly wrong child or the most perfect, calculating criminal you could ever imagine. The wall around him was getting higher and stronger with every passing minute. So, with the defense building this wall of reasonable doubt, the prosecution knew they had to answer one burning question that was hanging in the air. Why? If Asher Crawford was just a quiet, sensitive kid, what possible reason could he have for being involved in Noah Jensen's death? The answer, they argued, was festering in a place no one would have expected, a summer debate camp. Yeah, you heard that right. Debate camp. While most kids their age were at the beach or playing video games, Noah and Asher were at a prestigious 2-week program at the state university. And according to the prosecution, that's where the spark was lit. The star witness for this was a girl named Chloe, a fellow debater. She was nervous, fiddling with the sleeve of her sweater, but her memory was crystal clear. She described the final round of a tournament. It was Asher and Noah, head-to-head. The topic was environmental policy, and by all accounts, Asher was winning. His argument was airtight, full of complex data. He was minutes away from taking the trophy. But then, Noah pivoted. He didn't attack Asher's facts. He attacked their source. He revealed that a key statistic in Asher's argument came from a study that had been partially funded by a polluting corporation Asher's father had invested in. It wasn't cheating, not technically, but it made Asher's entire argument look dirty, hypocritical. Noah didn't just beat him, Chloe said, her voice soft. He dismantled him. He said, a compelling argument built on a rotten foundation is just a pretty lie. The whole room was watching. Asher just stood there, completely still. He didn't even pack up his note cards. He just walked off the stage. And the look in his eyes, it wasn't just anger. It was pure, cold hatred. The prosecution then entered their exhibit, a series of text messages from Asher's phone to a friend. They were brutal. One read, "Jensen's a fraud. He smiles and everyone loves him, but he's just a snake." Another said, "He thinks he's better than everyone. I wish he'd just disappear." The word disappear hung in the courtroom like a bad smell. This was the motive the prosecution was selling. A festering resentment. A humiliating, public defeat that festered over the following months into a dangerous obsession. They painted a picture of Asher as the brooding, intellectual outcast, secretly seething with rage at the popular golden boy jock who had shown him up. But then, the defense got their turn. And they didn't deny the texts or the story. They reframed it. Their attorney stood up, looking almost bored. "Teenage drama," he said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Let's be real. Have you ever met a teenager? They're emotional. They text things they don't mean. 'I wish he'd disappear,' is what a kid says when someone takes their parking spot or dates their crush. It's not a murder plot. It's hyperbole." He argued that the prosecution was taking typical, petty high school jealousy and inflating it into a murder motive after the fact. They need a reason, he told the jury, so they're grabbing onto the first piece of teenage angst they can find and calling it a conspiracy. And so, the battle lines were drawn. In one corner, a grudge, dark and serious enough to lead to murder. In the other, kid stuff, amplified by tragedy. And through all this talk of humiliation and hatred, Asher Crawford just sat at his table. He didn't shift in his seat when the texts were read. He didn't react to the story of his most humiliating moment. It was like they were talking about someone else. The question wasn't just what happened at Raven's Point anymore. It was who was sitting in that chair. A vengeful killer? Or a scapegoat for a tragic accident? The truth seemed to slip further away with every passing minute. You could feel it now, a subtle change in the air inside that courtroom. The initial clear-cut lines of good and evil, of grief and guilt, were starting to blur and fray at the edges. The trial was entering its final stages, and the relentless pressure was getting to everyone. It was like watching a rope stretched too tight, and you could just hear the individual fibers beginning to snap. The first sign was the Jensen family's own lawyer. He pulled David and Helen aside during a recess, his voice low and urgent. He talked about plea deals, about the uncertainty of a judge's ruling. "We could secure a guaranteed sentence right now," he pleaded. "We know what he did. Do we really need to risk him walking away over a legal technicality?" But Helen Jensen shook her head, her jaw set. She wasn't just looking for a conviction, she was looking for the truth. The whole, ugly, undeniable truth, laid out in open court for the world to see. She needed to hear a judge say the words. She needed to know why. And all the while, she kept this small, worn, leather-bound notebook clutched in her hands. A grief journal. She'd write in it during the breaks, her hand moving furiously. Sometimes, she'd just hold it, her fingers tracing the cover like it was a holy text. It was her testament, her record of the before and the after. You could see the weight of it in her eyes. But the biggest and most telling shift came from the bench. Judge Henderson. The man who had started this trial as a stoic, almost bored referee was now leaning forward, his eyes sharp and focused. He was no longer just processing information. He was actively hunting for it. His patience for the defense's grandstanding was wearing dangerously thin. At one point, the defense attorney was making another long-winded speech about reasonable doubt and the tyranny of public opinion. Judge Henderson didn't just let him finish. He cut him off, his voice like a whip crack. "Counselor," he said, and the whole room jumped. "Spare us the philosophy lecture. I've read the same case law you have. Stick to the facts of this case, not the fiction you're trying to sell. Move along." The defense attorney was left stammering, his face flushed. It was a small moment, but in the carefully choreographed ballet of a courtroom, it was an earthquake. Judges are supposed to be impartial, distant. They don't get involved. They don't show their hand. But Judge Henderson was showing his. He was losing his patience with the performance. And through all of this, the lawyer's desperation, the mother's quiet fury, the judge's simmering anger, the one constant, the one utterly calm point in the entire room, was Asher Crawford. He was like the eye of a hurricane. He'd occasionally scribble something on his legal pad, but it wasn't notes about the trial. Once, a bailiff walking past his table glanced down and saw he'd just been drawing intricate, interlocking geometric shapes. Perfect, precise, and utterly meaningless. He was in a world of his own, completely detached from the human storm raging around him. As the day ended and the case was adjourned for the final day of closing arguments, the feeling of unraveling was complete. The certainty was gone. The Jensen family was clinging to hope by a thread. The defense was scrambling. And Judge Henderson, he looked like a man who had seen a ghost, or perhaps had finally seen through a lie. He gathered his papers, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes lingering on Asher for a long, long moment before he stood and left the bench. The gavel echoed, and everyone was left with the unnerving sense that the real trial was only just beginning. This was it. The final day. There was no new evidence to present, no more witnesses to call. All that was left were words. The power of persuasion. The courtroom felt like a theater on opening night, every seat filled, every breath held. This was the last chance for both sides to sew everything together, to create a story the judge could believe in. The prosecutor went first. She stood slowly, her movements solemn, like a mourner at a graveside. She didn't head straight for the podium. Instead, she walked over to the Jensen family and let her gaze rest on them for a long moment, forcing everyone in the room to see their pain all over again. Then she turned to the bench, her voice low but carrying an immense, powerful weight. "Your Honor," she began, "for days, we have listened to theories and diagnoses. We've heard about social difficulties and misunderstood text messages. But I ask you to look past the noise. Look at the facts. A young man is dead. Another young man was the last person to see him alive, at a secluded spot, after months of documented resentment." She walked the judge through the timeline with the precision of a surgeon. The debate camp humiliation. The bitter texts. The gas station footage. The lack of any other plausible suspect. This wasn't an accident waiting to happen, she insisted, her voice rising with passion. It was a confrontation that did happen. A confrontation that Asher Crawford initiated, fueled by a grudge that festered into something dark and violent. She ended by pointing a steady finger at Asher. He sits there, showing no remorse, no emotion, because in his mind, he got away with it. He silenced the person who humiliated him. Do not let his silence now be the final word. The evidence, though circumstantial, forms an unbreakable chain. Find him guilty. Give Noah Jensen and his family the justice they deserve. It was a masterful performance. Heartfelt, logical, and powerful. You could feel the room swaying back toward the Jensens. It felt like a closing argument from a movie. Then, it was the defense's turn. His approach was the complete opposite. He stood calmly, buttoned his expensive suit jacket, and approached the judge with an air of almost pitying disappointment. "Your Honor," he started, sounding tired, as if he were the only sane man in a room full of hysterical people. What we have here is a tragedy in search of a villain. The prosecution has presented you with a story, a compelling one, I'll admit. But a story is not evidence. A story is what you tell when the facts aren't enough. He began picking apart the unbreakable chain. A verbal spat months ago? Teenage angst in a text message? A car being in the vicinity of a public road? This isn't a chain. It's a collection of loose threads, and the prosecution is asking you to weave them into a noose. He gestured toward Asher. They want you to convict this young man not for what he did, but for who he is. Because he doesn't cry on cue. Because he doesn't perform grief the way we expect him to. They are asking you to condemn a child because he doesn't fit our mold. That is not justice. That is prejudice. He finally stopped, letting the word prejudice hang in the air. The only just verdict, he concluded, his voice firm, is not guilty. The facts demand it. The arguments were over. The battle of stories was complete. Judge Henderson looked from one lawyer to the other, his expression unreadable. The entire case now rested on his shoulders alone. And then, he did something that surprised everyone. He looked directly at Asher Crawford. Not at his lawyer. At him. Asher Crawford, the judge said, his voice quiet but absolute. The evidence has been presented. The arguments have been made. Before I render my verdict, the law gives you the right to speak. Is there anything you would like to say? Every single person in that room leaned forward. This was the moment. Would he break down? Would he finally show a flicker of humanity? Would he confess? All eyes were locked on him. The silence was so profound you could hear the hum of the lights. Asher slowly lifted his head. He looked at the judge, his eyes as empty as they had been on day one. He didn't stand up. He didn't even clear his throat. He simply uttered two quiet, flat, utterly soulless words. "No, sir." A collective, almost imperceptible gasp rippled through the courtroom. The judge held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a single, sharp nod. "Very well. This court is in recess. I will return in 1 hour with my verdict." The gavel fell. The tension didn't break. It solidified, turning the air to stone. In 1 hour, they would have an answer. But as everyone filed out, shell-shocked, a terrifying question was on everyone's mind. Had they just witnessed the calm defiance of a guilty man, or the tragic, broken silence of a child in over his head? The answer was now in the hands of one man. That 1 hour recess felt like a lifetime. When the courtroom doors finally swung open again, the crowd rushed back in, a silent, frantic river of people desperate for an ending. There was no chatter this time. No whispered speculation. Just a heavy, breathless anticipation. The verdict was here. It was finally over. Judge Henderson took his seat on the bench. His face was grim, etched with the weight of the decision he was about to render. He didn't have a poker face anymore. He looked like a man who had just carried a great burden up a mountain. He arranged his papers with slow, deliberate movements, avoiding everyone's gaze. The only sound was the rustle of those papers and the frantic beating of 100 hearts. But before he could speak, the prosecutor stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice respectful but firm. "Before you read the verdict, the Jensen family would like to exercise their right to a victim impact statement." A low murmur rippled through the room. This was it. The final word before the judgment. Helen Jensen stood. She looked even smaller than before, as if the weight of the last hour had physically shrunk her. She walked to the lectern, her leather-bound journal clutched in both hands. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at Asher. She looked at some distant point on the back wall, as if she were speaking to her son directly. Her voice, when it came, was thin and reedy, but it had a razor's edge of pure, undiluted love. "Noah," she began, and the word was a prayer. "Your father, he talks about the light being gone. And he's right. But for a mother, it's the silence that kills you. It's the silence in your room where your music used to be. It's the silence at the breakfast table where your laugh should be. I still make your favorite pancakes on Sunday mornings. I set a plate for you. And I just sit there, and I listen to the silence. She described the mundane, heartbreaking details of a life half-lived. The college acceptance letter that came in the mail a week after he died. The way his dog still waited by the door every day at 3:15, the time he used to get home from school. She talked about the future he would never have, the wife he'd never marry, the children he'd never hold. "I don't just miss the son you were," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I miss the man you would have become. I miss all of it. Every single day." It was the most devastating thing anyone in that room had ever heard. Grown men were crying. The bailiff stared at his shoes, his jaw clenched tight. Judge Henderson had closed his eyes, as if absorbing each word like a physical blow. Helen took a shaky breath, gathering the last of her strength. She finally turned her head. She looked directly at Asher Crawford. "And you," she said, her voice trembling with a grief so profound it had moved beyond anger. "You took that. You took all of it. And I need to know why. I need to know what my son ever did to you that deserved this." She stood there, utterly broken, waiting for an answer that she knew would never come. And that's when it happened. Asher Crawford lifted his head. He met her gaze. And on his lips there formed a small, faint, but utterly unmistakable smile. It wasn't a smirk. It wasn't a grin of triumph. It was something far colder, far more chilling. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. A tiny, cruel curl of the lips that said, more clearly than any words ever could, "I have won." Time stopped. The entire courtroom froze, trying to process the impossible image in front of them. A grieving mother's plea met with a smile. It was a moral obscenity. It was a violation of every law of human decency. David Jensen let out a strangled sound, half-gasp, half-sob. The defense attorney's hand, which had been resting on Asher's arm, tightened into a white-knuckled grip. And Judge Henderson, his eyes snapped open. He didn't look at the weeping mother. He didn't look at the shocked crowd. His entire being was focused on that smile. His face, which had been heavy with sorrow, transformed. The lines of grief hardened into lines of fury. The weariness in his eyes was burned away by a cold blue flame of absolute, righteous anger. He didn't reach for the verdict. He didn't reach for his gavel. He leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the stunned silence like a knife. "Mr. Crawford," he said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "For 7 days, I have watched you." Every single person held their breath. Right there, in that moment, what would you have done? Would you have seen a remorseless killer or a deeply troubled child? What would your verdict be? Comment your gut reaction below. The judge's voice didn't boom. It didn't need to. It was a low, controlled, and utterly terrifying sound, the calm before a tornado touches down. Every syllable was measured, dripping with a contempt so profound it sucked all the air out of the room. "For 7 days," Judge Henderson repeated, his eyes locked on Asher, "I have watched you. I have listened to the carefully constructed lies. I have observed your performance. And that smile, is the final unforgivable act." Asher's smile vanished, wiped away as if by an unseen hand. For the first time, a crack appeared in his armor. A flicker of something, confusion, fear, in his eyes. He looked to his lawyer, but the lawyer was just as frozen as everyone else, staring up at the bench in utter disbelief. "The purpose of this court," the judge continued, leaning so far forward he seemed to be looming over the entire room, "is to seek the truth. But this proceeding has been poisoned by a narrative so false, so manipulative, that it insults the very concept of justice." He shifted his gaze from Asher to the defense attorney. "Your entire case, counselor, has been a masterpiece of misdirection. Look at his flat effect," he mocked, his voice taking on a sing-song quality. "Look at his social difficulties. He can't be guilty because he doesn't perform guilt correctly. You have asked this court to excuse a complete and total lack of remorse by hiding behind a diagnosis." Then he turned his fiery gaze to the prosecution. "And you," he said, and the prosecutor flinched. You were so focused on the easy story. The jealous outcast. The grudge. It was a neat, tidy box. And you were so desperate to close the lid that you missed what was staring you in the face. He paused, letting the accusations hang in the air. No one moved. No one breathed. This wasn't happening. Judges don't do this. They don't interrupt the verdict for a monologue. They don't openly accuse lawyers of misconduct. This was a legal earthquake. This case was never about a debate camp, Judge Henderson said, his voice dropping again, becoming almost conversational, which was somehow even more frightening. It was never about teenage jealousy. You were fighting over the wrong motive. You were pointing at the wrong villain. He reached down beside his bench. He picked up a simple, legal-sized manila envelope that had been sitting there, unnoticed by everyone. It wasn't a flashy exhibit. It was plain, almost humble. Before I render a verdict in any case, the judge explained, I review the entirety of the evidence file. Personally. Meticulously. It is my duty. And in doing so, I came across a piece of evidence that was logged, but never explained. Dismissed as irrelevant. He opened the envelope and pulled out a single folded piece of blue stationery. The paper looked expensive. This was found in Noah Jensen's school locker, retrieved by his parents after his death. It was delivered to him on the morning of the day he died. It was mixed in with his textbooks, considered part of his personal effects, and its significance was tragically overlooked. He unfolded the paper. The sound of the crinkling paper was the only sound in the universe. It is a letter, the judge said, from a young woman named Eleanor Crawford. The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Crawford. Asher's head snapped up. His parents, Richard and Victoria, who had been sitting like statues, suddenly stiffened, their masks of composure cracking into pure, unadulterated panic. It seems, the judge said, a bitter edge to his voice, that the connection between the Crawford and Jensen families was far deeper and far more intimate than anyone in this courtroom has disclosed. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. My dearest Noah, he read, and his voice, though that of an older man, carried the weight of a young woman's fear. I'm so sorry. I was a coward. I should have never told my family about us. I should have never told them I'm pregnant. A wave of gasps erupted, but the judge silenced it with a single raised hand, his eyes never leaving the letter. He continued reading. When I told them, they were furious. They said you were a gold digger, that you would ruin my future. They said they would handle it. Asher was in the room. He heard everything. He got this strange, quiet look on his face. You know how he gets. Last night, he came to my room and said, Don't worry, Ellie. I'll make the problem go away. Noah, I'm scared. I'm scared of what he might do. Meet me at the point tonight. Please. We have to figure this out. We have to leave. All my love, Eleanor. Judge Henderson finished reading. He let the hand holding the letter fall to the bench. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world. The entire case, the entire narrative, shattered into a million pieces. It wasn't about a debate. It was about a baby. It was about a family's reputation. It was about a brother's twisted sense of duty. Asher was no longer just a boy with a grudge. He was an enforcer. A weapon aimed by his powerful parents at the boy who dared to love their daughter and threaten their perfect image. Judge Henderson looked at Asher, whose face was now as white as the walls. The smile, the judge said, his voice quiet and deadly. That's what I finally understood. That wasn't the smile of a killer proud of his work. That was the smile of a puppet who thought his masters had pulled the strings perfectly. That was the smile of a boy who believed his family's power and lies had once again made him untouchable. He placed the blue letter down on the bench with finality. The verdict in this case, he announced, is delayed. Because this court has been operating on a fundamental lie. And we are not leaving this room until the truth, the whole truth, is finally spoken. For a long moment, nobody moved. It was as if the judge's words had cast a spell, freezing everyone in a single stunned tableau. The blue envelope sat on the bench, a small, simple object that had just blown a hole in the side of the entire trial. The defense attorney was the first to break. He shot to his feet, his face a thundercloud of outrage. "Your Honor, this is highly improper. This document has not been entered into evidence. It has not been subjected to cross-examination. This is a blatant violation of procedure, and I move for an immediate mistrial." Judge Henderson didn't even flinch. He looked down at the lawyer with an expression of pure, unvarnished contempt. "You want to talk about procedure, counselor?" The judge's voice was dangerously soft. "Let's talk about procedure. The procedure of a family using their influence to hide the true motive for a murder. The procedure of a boy being manipulated into committing violence to protect a reputation. That is the violation we are dealing with today. Your motion for a mistrial is noted and denied. Now, sit down." The command was so absolute, so final, that the lawyer, for once, was rendered speechless. He sank back into his chair, looking utterly defeated. The judge then picked up the blue envelope again, handling it not like evidence, but like a sacred, terrible relic. "This letter," he said, his voice resonating through the silent room, "was authenticated by the state's own forensics lab weeks ago. The handwriting is a match for Eleanor Crawford's. The paper bears her fingerprint. Its legitimacy is not in question. Its relevance, however, was deliberately buried." He turned his gaze to Richard and Victoria Crawford. They looked like they were staring into the abyss. Victoria had a hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Richard was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his head bowed as if awaiting an executioner's blow. "The contents of this letter," Judge Henderson continued, "provide the missing key. They answer the why that Mrs. Jensen so desperately pleaded for. Noah Jensen wasn't killed over a debate. He was killed because he loved the wrong person. He was killed because he represented a threat to a wealthy family's pristine image." He didn't need to read the letter again. Its devastating words were still echoing in the mind of everyone present. "I'm pregnant," Asher said. "I'll make the problem go away." The judge connected the dots aloud, his voice like chipping ice. The confrontation at Ravens Point wasn't a spontaneous act of rage from a humiliated boy. It was a planned meeting, yes, but not between two rivals. It was a mission. Asher Crawford went there on behalf of his family. To handle the problem. To scare Noah Jensen into disappearing. The defense is correct about one thing. Asher was following orders. But the orders didn't come from some vague teenage angst. They came from the people sitting right behind him. He let that accusation hang in the air, a poison cloud settling over the Crawford family. This letter doesn't just exonerate a grudge, it inculpates an entire family. It reveals a conspiracy of silence. A conspiracy to obstruct justice. It shows that Asher Crawford is not the mastermind here. He is a pawn. A deeply troubled, manipulated pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. And then, Judge Henderson did something extraordinary. He looked directly at Asher, and for the first time, his voice held a sliver of something other than fury. It was a grim, heartbreaking pity. "The smile," the judge said softly, almost to himself. "Now I understand it completely. It wasn't just satisfaction. It was relief. You thought you had done your job. You had protected the family name. You had followed the script perfectly. You sat through this entire trial, listening to us argue about a debate, knowing it was all a lie, and you thought your family's money and power had built a wall around you. You smiled because you thought you were safe." In that moment, the entire facade of the Crawford family crumbled into dust. The expensive suits, the calm demeanor, the air of superiority, it all evaporated, leaving behind a raw, trembling core of shame and fear. The blue envelope had done more than reveal a secret. It had broken a spell. And the truth, now free, began to hunt for its rightful place. The judge's words hung in the air, not as an accusation, but as a key turning in a lock. And with that turn, something inside of Asher Crawford broke wide open. For a long second, he just sat there, his shoulders beginning to shake. The cold, detached mask he'd worn for days didn't just fall away, it shattered. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, a sob that seemed to be torn from somewhere deep and dark within him. He wasn't a calculating killer anymore. He was a 15-year-old boy, terrified and trapped. He looked up at Judge Henderson, his eyes swimming with tears, his face crumpled in anguish. "They said he was going to ruin everything." The words burst out of him, high-pitched and desperate, cutting through the stunned silence of the courtroom. "They said he was a gold digger, that he was just after our money and that he'd destroy Ellie's future." He was trembling violently now, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him from drowning. "My dad, he said we had to protect the family, that Noah was a problem that needed to be managed." Asher's voice cracked, mimicking his father's cold corporate language. "He told me to go talk to him, to make him see reason, to scare him into leaving her alone." He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean for. I just drove out to Ravens Point. I was so angry. At Noah, for messing everything up. At my parents, for making me do their dirty work. I pulled up next to his car. We started yelling. He said he loved Ellie. He said they were going to keep the baby and there was nothing we could do about it." Asher's story was tumbling out now, a chaotic, heartbreaking confession. "He called our family a bunch of soulless snobs. I saw red. I screamed at him. I said, 'Just disappear.' I gunned my engine and swerved toward his car, just to scare him, to make him back down. But he overcorrected. His tires hit the gravel at the edge of the cliff, and he just went over." The image he painted was horrifyingly clear. Not a premeditated murder, but a reckless, teenage act of intimidation that spiraled into tragedy in the blink of an eye. "I didn't push him. I didn't touch his car. But I caused it," Asher wailed, his body collapsing in on itself. "I drove away. I was so scared. I went home and I told my parents what happened. And my mom, she hugged me. She said, 'It's okay, sweetheart. You didn't mean to. It was an accident.' But my dad, he got very quiet. He said, 'This never happened. You were never there. We will handle it.'" The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The cover-up. The manipulation. The way the Crawfords had used their son as a weapon and then tried to bury the consequences. "They hired the lawyer. They told me what to say. They told me to be quiet, to show no emotion, that my condition would make people doubt I could do it." He spat the word condition out like it was poison. "They said if I just followed the script, everything would be okay. They said the system would protect us." He looked at the judge, his expression one of utter devastation and shame. "I smiled, because I thought they were right. I thought we were going to win. I thought I had been a good son." The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't stunned or shocked. It was heavy with a terrible, heartbreaking understanding. The monster the town had feared was just a child. A child used and broken by the very people who were supposed to protect him. At the defense table, Asher's lawyer had his head in his hands. The Crawford parents were a portrait of ruin. Richard Crawford stared blankly ahead, his empire of lies crumbling around him. Victoria Crawford was weeping, but they were not tears of grief for Noah or for her son. They were tears of self-pity, for the ruin of her own perfect life. Judge Henderson did not call for order. He did not bang his gavel. He simply watched as the sobbing boy was finally, truly seen by the court. The truth was out. It was messy, it was ugly, and it was far more tragic than anyone could have imagined. The grudge was a lie. The accident was a cover for a deeper, more insidious crime, a family that valued its reputation more than it valued a human life. And in that moment, everyone knew the real trial was just beginning. The truth, once it broke free, didn't just settle quietly. It exploded. Asher's raw, sobbing confession wasn't just an admission of guilt. It was a wrecking ball that swung through the entire courtroom, smashing the carefully constructed walls the Crawfords had built around themselves. For a moment, There was only the sound of Asher's ragged crying. Then, chaos erupted. The defense attorney was on his feet again, but this time, it wasn't for a theatrical objection. He was frantically trying to distance himself from the nuclear meltdown happening at his table. Your Honor, I had no knowledge of this. My client has clearly been operating under extreme duress and coercion. But Judge Henderson's attention was already elsewhere. His gaze was fixed on Richard and Victoria Crawford. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was like ice. Richard and Victoria Crawford, he intoned, each word a nail in the coffin of their old life. Based on the testimony given from this stand, which I note was not under oath but is a compelling admission of facts, you are both hereby detained as material witnesses and potential accomplices to obstruction of justice, coercion of a minor, and conspiracy. He gave a sharp nod to the bailiffs. Two of them moved with purpose, their heavy footsteps echoing in the silent room. They didn't go to Asher. They walked past him, toward his parents. Victoria Crawford let out a short, sharp scream, more of outrage than fear, as the bailiff took her arm. "You can't do this. This is a travesty," she shrieked, her perfectly coiffed hair coming undone as she struggled. Richard Crawford was a different story. As the bailiff approached, he simply stood. He didn't look at his weeping wife or his broken son. He stared straight ahead, his face a cold, impassive mask, as if he were already in a prison cell, mentally divorcing himself from the disaster. He held out his wrists for the handcuffs with a chilling, robotic compliance. The mighty had fallen, and they had fallen silently. But the real crack in the wall, the one that truly signaled the end, was happening at the defense table. With his parents being led away, Asher was completely alone. His lawyer had physically moved his chair away, creating a space of empty air around the boy, as if his failure were a contagious disease. Asher watched his parents go. He saw his mother's hysterics, his father's cold surrender. And in that moment, the last of his composure vanished. The boy who had been trained to show nothing, to feel nothing, completely broke down. He buried his face in his hands, his small body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the very core of his being. He wasn't crying for the trouble he was in. He was crying because the people he had done it all for, the family he had tried to protect, were gone. And he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Judge Henderson watched this entire scene unfold, his expression unreadable. He then turned his attention to the Jensen family. They were holding on to each other, their faces a complex map of emotions: horror, pity, a grim sense of vindication, and a deep, lingering sorrow. Helen Jensen wasn't looking at the Crawfords. She was looking at Asher, the boy who had killed her son. And in his complete and total devastation, she didn't see a monster. She saw a ruined child, a tool that had been used and discarded. The anger that had sustained her for months began to slowly drain away, replaced by a weary, profound sadness for all of it. For Noah, for herself, and yes, even for the sobbing boy at the defense table. The crack in the wall wasn't just in the Crawford family's facade. It was in the simple black-and-white story of good and evil that everyone had clung to. The truth had made everything messy, complicated, and infinitely more tragic. The real crime wasn't just a car forced off a road. It was a family that had sold its soul, and a boy who had been forced to pay the price. The chaos settled into a heavy, solemn quiet. The Crawford parents were gone, their empty seats a stark reminder of the corruption that had poisoned the entire case. All that was left was a weeping boy, a grieving family, and a judge who now had to pick up the pieces. Judge Henderson let the silence hold for a long moment, allowing the gravity of what had just happened to sink in. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The fire of accusation was gone, replaced by the weary, resonant tone of a man delivering a eulogy for the truth. "Asher Crawford," he began, and the boy flinched, slowly raising his tear-streaked face. "The law requires me to enter a verdict based on the charges before this court. And on the charge of involuntary manslaughter, based on your own admission of acting with reckless disregard for human life, I find you guilty." The word "guilty" echoed, but it didn't carry the triumph one might expect. It felt less like a punishment and more like a simple, tragic statement of fact. "But," the judge continued, leaning forward, his eyes locked on Asher, This court is not blind to the whole truth. You were a weapon wielded by the adults who were supposed to guide you. You were manipulated, coerced, and then instructed to hide behind a facade of mental difference. That does not absolve you of responsibility, but it fundamentally changes how this court must respond. He then did something remarkable. He turned to the Jensen family. "Mr. and Mrs. Jensen," he said, his voice softening. "You came here seeking justice for your son, Noah. You believed the system would deliver it. And I must apologize to you. This process almost failed you. It almost allowed a deeper, more insidious crime to be hidden behind a convenient, petty narrative. The truth you deserved was nearly lost. For that, I am deeply sorry." He turned back to Asher. "The sentence of this court is that you will be remanded to the state's juvenile correctional facility until the age of 21. However," he paused, letting the word hang, "this will not be a punishment of pure incarceration. The court will mandate, and I will personally oversee, that you are enrolled in intensive psychological therapy and rehabilitation. You are not just a perpetrator, Asher. You are also a victim of your family's corruption. And this court will not simply lock you away and throw away the key. It will try, for Noah's sake, and for your own, to salvage the human being buried beneath the lies." It was a different kind of justice. It was messy. It was nuanced. It acknowledged that while a life had been taken, another life had been profoundly broken. He then addressed the room one final time. "As for the matters of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and coercion, this case is now referred to the District Attorney's Office for immediate investigation and prosecution against Richard and Victoria Crawford. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell. It wasn't a sharp, angry crack this time. It was a dull, final thud. A period at the end of a long, painful sentence. There was no celebration. The Jensen family stood, holding each other up. David Jensen put his arm around his wife, and they slowly walked out, their heads held a little higher, but their hearts still impossibly heavy. They had their truth. But it hadn't brought their son back. Asher was led away by a different bailiff, one whose grip was firm but not cruel. He wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. He was staring at the floor, a lost boy being taken to a place where, for the first time, someone might actually try to help him. Judge Henderson remained on the bench for a long time after the room had emptied, staring at the blue envelope on his desk. He had upheld the law. But more importantly, he had fought for the truth. In the end, that was the only justice that really mattered. Months later, on a crisp autumn morning when the leaves in Cedar Falls had turned to fire, Helen and David Jensen visited Noah's grave. The air was clean and cold, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the courtroom. They placed a simple, fresh sunflower on the headstone, Noah's favorite. They didn't speak for a long time. The silence was different now. It wasn't the screaming, empty silence of loss. It was a quiet, peaceful one. The kind you share when there are no more words left to say, only memory. They had their answer. They knew the why. It was a horrible, ugly why, but it was real. The scholarship in Noah's name for young aspiring architects was already receiving applications. It was their way of fighting the silence, of building something new from the ruins. The Crawford family was gone from Cedar Falls. Their company collapsed under the scandal. Richard and Victoria were awaiting their own separate trials, their wealth and influence now useless, their legacy reduced to a cautionary tale whispered at the town's coffee shop. And Asher? He was in the juvenile facility, just as the judge had ordered. The reports were that he was a model resident, but a quiet one. He attended his therapy sessions diligently. For the first time in his life, he was being asked what he felt, what he wanted, not what he was told to be. The path to healing, his therapist said, would be long. The wall his family had built around him was gone, but the rubble was still there, and he was slowly, carefully, learning how to clear it away. Back in his chambers, Judge Henderson would sometimes look at the blue envelope, now sealed in an evidence box. He hadn't sought praise for what he did. He saw it as his duty. But he knew that day had changed more than just one case. It had been a reminder that justice isn't just about verdicts and sentences. It's about listening for the truth, even when it whispers. It's about having the courage to snap the system out of its own routine when a human life hangs in the balance. Helen Jensen closed her grief journal for the last time. She didn't need to write in it anymore. The story was complete. It was a terrible story, but it was theirs. As she turned to leave the cemetery, her hand found her husband's. The sun broke through the clouds, warming their faces. It was over. The long, painful, heartbreaking season was finally over. And in the quiet that remained, there was, at last, a fragile space for peace to begin growing again. This story proves that the truth is often hidden in the smallest details, the ones everyone else misses. If you were gripped by this search for justice, subscribe for more. Next week, we dive into the case of the stepfather's perfect alibi, and you will not believe the secret the family dog revealed.